Welcome back to the Leadership Lab. I'm your host, Evan McGugan, former naval officer with over a decade of real-world leadership experience in special operations. I went to the United States Naval Academy. I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology of leadership from Penn State. And now I advise executives, elite coaches, athletes, working professionals, and tradesmen on how to lead, motivate, and win. And this podcast is where I take that mix of academic background and pressure tested experience and translate it into practical lessons for you. So let's get into today's topic. Now, I think the leadership industry has a huge problem. And despite it being a $300 billion industry, so much of what's out there keeps selling single solution leadership models. You hear the be confident, communicate more, inspire your people, connect, take care of your team, do the right thing. And while all those things are important, I'm not going to argue that. On their own, they tend to be a little too abstract to actually work, especially under pressure. And sometimes it can even get worse. And you'll hear things like, the louder you are, the stronger your presence is, or the more passionate you sound, the better you lead. And that kind of thinking, I think, fails people because it misses context at best and it creates actors at worst. And it seems very fraudulent very quickly. And it doesn't lead to outstanding leadership. So my experience and the data tell a much different story. Like all my podcasts, I try to back it in legitimate science. And so to help with today's topic, I'm going to rely on a set of studies done by Robert Mumford, who's prolific in the leadership literature, particularly in the Leadership Quarterly. And he conducted a study and wrote a conceptual paper that basically found that three types of leaders appeared again and again. And those three types of leaders were charismatic leaders, ideological leaders, and pragmatic leaders. And what he found was that each one worked, but only under specific conditions. And what that means is that there's no single formula for leadership. Just like there's no one way to teach, or there's no one single way to get in shape, there's no one single way to lead people. It's all about context and it's all about fit. And outstanding leadership, from what I can tell and what the data seems to suggest, is that it depends on your ability to match your leadership approach to the context that's in front of you. And I think that's why so much of leadership advice falls flat. It's built around one style. And the one style that people are espousing may be really good on its own, whether it's charismatic or servant leadership or transformational leadership or pragmatic leadership or charismatic leadership that we'll talk about today, or any other approach for that matter. The proponent that advocates for it usually assumes or is attempting to communicate that it works everywhere. And I think that's just wrong. And the data suggests that that's wrong as well. Even the popular approaches like transformational leadership or servant leadership that are highly romanticized, they can collapse when they're taken out of context. And at best, they work better for some people rather than others. Transformational leaders doesn't work as well with like highly ambitious and self-starters nearly as much as it does with introverted and shy people. So, for example, charismatic leaders, they work really well when things are stable and people are optimistic for the future. But if you drop that same leader into an environment that's high stress, highly dynamic, technical, high stakes, the system ends up eating them alive if they don't have any other leadership tools at their disposal. So we don't need leaders who just sound good. We don't need leaders who believe in what they're doing. We need leaders who do all of that, plus the leaders who are able to think clearly while they do it. So if there isn't a single right way to lead, then what actually works? So we're going to take a look at three mental blueprints that every leader seems to run on, at least according to the science. And those three pathways, which I'm going to introduce and then go into each in more detail, are the charismatic, ideological, and pragmatic leaders. And these aren't personality types. These are mental operating systems that individuals use to attempt to solve leadership problems. So the first one is charismatic leaders. These are the ones who lead with vision. So think of the Simon Sinek's. They frame problems around future possibility and optimism about the future. And they'll say things like, here's the future we can build together. And they thrive when optimism is really high and the environment is perceived as stable. But when ambiguity goes up and the perceived threats from the environment, whether it's internal or external to the organization, go up and things start to get messy, their emotion that they're able to evoke in their people can't outpace the entropy or the rate at which their systems start to fall apart. So this approach has some shortcomings. The next leader are the ideological leaders. Think of the John C. Maxwell. These leaders are the ones who lead with belief, and they anchor their leadership principles in shared values and traditions. And they really shine during moral conflict or crises or scandals when people on the team or the organization perceive some sort of threat. But when their conviction hardens and the world changes faster than their belief system can adapt, then they end up getting stuck. So this approach has its shortcomings as well. And then the third leader, or the third type of leader, is the pragmatic leader. And this are the types of leaders who lead with clarity. Think of the Jocko Willinks and the Leif Babins of the world. They see cause and effect, they analyze systems, they correct course, and they thrive in real world complexity with high stakes and high pressure. They're not always the most exciting leaders, particularly to listen to when they talk, but the data and my experience suggests that they consistently produce the best performance outcomes for the team and organizations over the long run. So I'm going to go into why they do that, but even if you don't buy that set of ideas yet, the key idea here with these different types of leaders is that different problems demand different types of thinking, and picking the wrong solution to a leadership problem ends up leading to dysfunction or destruction or some sort of disengagement from your team. Think of the analogy of trying to act charismatic when you're trying to fix a business problem like accounting or logistics. It's like trying to fix a jet engine with a pep talk. Or if you're trying to lead pragmatically and solve a systems problem when your team is undergoing some sort of moral crisis, it's like bringing a spreadsheet to a funeral. And then if you're trying to lead ideology with values and tradition in a technical crisis, then you're like preaching to a circuit. So all that brings us to what I think is the most important nugget from Mumford's research. And that is the way you think and the context you're leading in determines whether or not you're going to lead effectively. So Mumford's research flipped decades of leadership theory on its head, particularly at a time when a lot of the leadership literature focused around innate qualities and personality. His research indicated that leadership performance is more about how leaders think than the talent or the personality that they bring to bear in the leadership problems. And he called it leader cognition, and he characterized it as the mental architecture behind a leader's decision making. On the experimental side of Mumford's research, there were a bunch of teams that they got together, and they were asked to solve complex problems with open-ended challenges where they had to design new programs, come up with a solution, manage some sort of crisis. And the researchers watched how people led and observed and recorded what actually worked. And there were three patterns that emerged. The first was that charismatic leaders tended to lead with emotion and vision. Again, think the Simon Sinek, start with why, leaders eat last, all great ideas. The second was that Ideological leaders led with conviction and shared values. So think of the John C. Maxwell's of getting your people to believe in you and trust in you and working on things that you actually believe in. And then the third pattern that emerged was that the pragmatic leaders led with logic and structure and cause and effect reasoning. Think Jocko Willink, think Leif Babin, think prioritize, execute, shoot, move, communicate, laws of combat, all those great things. When they measured performance outcomes in terms of these three leadership categories, they found that each style only worked when the environment matched the thinking pattern. So charisma thrived in optimism, ideology thrived in moral threat. But when things got complex and unclear and technical and high stakes and high pressure, then pragmatic leaders tended to dominate. You know, so what really separates ideological, charismatic, and pragmatic leaders, how much a leader can match their thinking style to the problem at hand. Again, charismatic leaders think in stories. They motivate through emotion and purpose and shared vision. And you'll hear the people that are advocates for charismatic leaders or charismatic leadership say that you should believe in something bigger than yourself. Ideological leaders think in beliefs. They want to unify people around some sort of identity and trust and cohesion. And they'll teach you to believe in what you're doing is the right thing. Whereas pragmatic leaders, they think in systems. So they diagnose, they prioritize, and they execute. Type of leadership creates its own type of energy. Charisma generates excitement. Ideology creates unity, and pragmatism produces clarity. But a really effective leader is one who is able to tap into all three approaches, particularly in modern environments where things tend to be stable and complexity tends to be really high. Clarity is going to be most important in the long run, but you still need the charismatic leadership to create energy. You still need the ideological leadership to create unity. And then you need the pragmatic leadership to sustain the systems of the actual organization that you're a part of. In any case, that's why Mumford's team called pragmatism a cognitive advantage when it comes to leadership. And it's not intelligence as a measure of general cognitive ability, but it's more about how accurate you can map and adjust to your reality. So what they found was that pragmatic leaders are simply able to model their reality better than the other three leaders tend to be able to. And I think this is partly where so much of the leadership coaching out there goes wrong. If you watch a TED Talk or an Instagram reel or a TikTok video or a leadership masterclass, there's a lot of leadership advice out there that relies on single approaches, which are often explained using cookie cutter lines, which are performative at worst. It teaches performance or imitation, but it doesn't teach the cognition which matches the complex yet stable environment, which is most modern organizations where people tend to lead. They want you to act confidently, and they try to train you to act confidently, and they want you to be empathetic, but it really ends up being performing empathy rather than being authentically empathetic. When instead, you should be those things, but they should be training you to think more clearly. A quick personal thought, effective leadership doesn't copy charisma or fake concern, because those things should be authentic. You should be so competent in what you do that the confidence is actually real. And you should find something compelling about what you're working on that you're actually excited to execute, and you're actually excited to communicate about it. And you should definitely take the time to get to know your people and actually care about their well-being. Because if you don't know your people, then you can't actually influence them because you don't know what they want. We had a saying when I was in the SEAL teams that people are more important than hardware. And the reason why that principle was so important to us is because your people are your most important resource, no matter what industry you are, no matter how high tech it is, how automated it is, there's always people involved in an organization. And the reason why it's so important to leadership, because the business of leadership is the business of people. Enough of my diatribe. What separates great leaders in complex and mostly stable environments, which is the modern corporate world, is their ability to engineer clarity. They build mental systems and real physical systems that fit their environment, because inspiration is important, particularly early on, but it fades really, really fast. And then what do? It's the clarity that ends up compounding over the long term. So answer leaders are the ones who memorize tactics, but professional leaders design systems. And pragmatic leaders are leaders who build the best systems because they tend not to chase emotion. They're better at diagnosing, they're better at slowing things down, and then they're better at fixing the root cause of problems than the other two types of leaders are. And I think all this is one of the reasons why people make leadership out to be this mysterious thing. You know, it's not all that complicated to some degree. It's believing in what you're working on. It's communicating that belief in a compelling way through your words and through your actions and how you move. But it's also contextual problem solving at scale. Yet so many organizations who do leadership seminars or pay people to come in and do leadership seminars or send their people away to leadership seminars or host offsites or organization retreats or work with leadership coaches, they end up promoting some variation of charismatic or ideological leadership and try to force fit it into a complex yet stable environment, and then wonder why the system keeps breaking down 3 months later. Leadership isn't the 3-day offsite where you get really excited about what you're working on. It's the 3 months after the offsite where you have to implement all the systems, all the feedback loops, all the logistics trains, all the accounting system, all those things end up being the leadership problems that you spend most of your time on in a modern organization. So yes, the charismatic leadership is important early on for igniting energy and getting people motivated to work. And ideological leadership is important for getting people unified around shared values and shared traditions. But most of the time that you spend in a leadership position are spent on solving pragmatic problems, which is systems thinking. If you look around in your environment, whether you're in construction or whether you're in a coaching business or healthcare or you're in the defense industry or you're in business tech, these are all complex systems. There's too much information. There's not enough time. There's too many moving parts. And so what the science seems to suggest, and my experience seems to suggest, both make a really good case that charismatic leadership works, but it works best in opportunity where environments are stable and everyone's hoping for the future. Ideological leadership works best in crises where people perceive their values are under threat. And then pragmatic leadership works the best in complexity where environments are stable, but the situation is still messy and still multidimensional. So if you work in a system where things are relatively stable, but priorities shift daily and your decisions carry consequences and the clarity from day to day tends to be rare, well, then you don't need charismatic leadership because you don't need energy. You don't need ideological leadership because you don't necessarily need unity and shared values. You need pragmatic leadership that helps you build systems that last through the complexity. You don't need another motivational poster on your wall or above the door. You need structure and clarity and better ways to execute. That's the essence of pragmatic leadership. It's not flashy, it's functional, and it's boring. But lucky for everyone, it's one of the things that I love to teach because it's the type of leadership that I am most drawn to. So if you're interested in that, go check out Leadership Lab on Skool. Check out the video link in the description. Let's recap what the data really shows before we move on. Leadership is cognitive. It's not just charismatic or ideological. Really good, outstanding, effective leaders are able to decide between style and the environment. Most of modern work happens in stable, complex systems where pragmatism wins. And then belief and charisma both matter very early on for buy-in, but mismatch that cognition when you're trying to solve systems problems ends up breaking performance after that initial motivation and that initial buy-in fades. So now that we understand the different thinking patterns that drive certain leadership outcomes, let's talk about how mismatch shows up in real life. Most of the leadership coaching out there, charisma gets really celebrated, ideology gets admired, but unfortunately for modern leaders, pragmatic leadership gets ignored. Decision trees, 2x2 matrix, thought pyramids, risk assessments, they're all boring, but they're the fundamental processes behind effective leadership. And like any other endeavor, whether it's organizations or sports, fundamentals done exceptionally well are the things that win championships. If you go and look at Olympic wrestlers in the Olympics, you'll see that what they're doing to win is fundamental wrestling done exceptionally well. And so in Mumford experiments, the charismatic leaders were the ones that scored higher in inspiration, and ideological leaders scored really high in commitment to values. But the pragmatic leaders were the ones who actually scored highest in actual performance results when it comes to solving novel problems, implementing feasible solutions. But we still reward noise over systems and over nuance when it comes to leadership coaching. And you take a look at any leader in your organization on LinkedIn. Their LinkedIn profile is usually really impressive. They portray some sort of charisma or ideological leadership or some other version of like romanticized leadership, whether it's transformational or servant leadership. And every LinkedIn post that they make usually revolves around something like that. But how many of these leaders actually collapse when the pressure hits? Well, that's probably because they're not familiar with how to actually be pragmatic leaders. It's leadership isn't about presence. It's not necessarily just about belief. Those things are important. It's also about precision. The best leaders don't just walk into a room and dominate it, and they don't just display the strongest beliefs in what they're doing. They're also the ones who are able to design systems and walk away and the systems run without them, at least for like some period of time. And I think this is where most people fall back on the easy fix, and that's motivation. People will have some sort of performance drop, and instead of taking a scalpel to their systems, they'll go on to some retreat, or they'll go to some seminar, or they'll listen to some motivational speech on their way to work in the morning instead of actually fixing the root cause. And that's what pragmatic leaders do really well. So the leadership advice that I see so much sells some form of motivation or values, and people eat it up. It's really fun to listen to. It's really inspiring, and it can even make you feel some sort of like moral righteousness once you're done with it. Find your why, be the change that you want to see, believe in yourself. Like motivation feels good, but it's fleeting. And there's a reason why you hear people like Jocko Willink say, discipline over everything. Because when motivation fades and the pressure spikes, like the systems are the things that actually stay in place, not your motivation. Motivation is very, very fleeting, particularly when things get hard. So high performing leaders are the ones who are able to build systems that maintain clarity and control when pressure spikes. They design frameworks, and they do it in a way that seems to make their composure seem automatic, but it's not. It's how they've engineered processes and procedures and tactics and techniques and whatever it is, whatever system that they implemented, they've done it to such a degree that they fall back on those systems when the pressure spikes instead of trying to fall back on motivation. If you think about the highest performing organizations in the world, pro sports teams, elite military units like the SEAL teams, which is where I was trained, where I was forged as a leader, the top corporate firms, they all know, whether intuitively or explicitly, that belief and motivation can absolutely kickstart momentum, but the systems are what sustains it over the long term. So, charismatic leadership is great, but it's not just about being fired up. It's about being able to create enough structure to where when you're tired, when you're distracted, or hell, even under fire, like you still perform those leadership roles. And one of the things that I think I do really well, because I'm a pragmatic leader, is I am able to teach that architecture. Now, I struggle when it comes to charismatic leadership. I struggle when it comes to ideological leadership, particularly with what I'm working on is not something I necessarily value. But if you find yourself in those situations where you are a pragmatic leader and you struggle with charisma, or you struggle with values and traditions and unity and cohesion, then leverage people on your team that don't. Leverage the people that are more charismatic, leverage the people that are able to build unity and cohesion and make up for your shortcomings. But since I think like a pragmatic leader, and most of the leadership problems that people tend to encounter in their modern work environments are pragmatic problems, then that's something that I think I can help people with. So if that's something you're interested in, check out the Leadership Lab on Skool. So let's bring this all together to close it out. Why does most leadership advice fall flat? Well, it's one of a few things. One, it pretends leadership is a one approach fits all. It tends to focus on talent or traits or innate qualities instead of thinking ability, often ignores context, and then it has a habit of rewarding tricks or tools that create popularity rather than pure performance. And it also sells motivation instead of boring systems like decision trees and 2x2 matrices and thought pyramids and things like that that actually help you make better decisions as a leader. Leadership isn't a personality or an act. It's a process. It's a process of getting people to expend effort towards a mutually agreed upon goal. It's the process of getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And that doesn't just mean being charismatic, although you definitely should be. And it's not just about believing in what you're doing and getting other people to believe it with you, although you should. It's also about thinking clearly and thinking with precision and thinking with accuracy. So if this resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, Leadership Lab, and make sure you check out the free PDF guide that I made, that 10-day leadership sprint. This is a 10-day crash course, quick framework to get you to understand how to diagnose your leadership problem and how to re-engineer your leadership approach quickly in 10 days so that you can actually lead under pressure. And then join me in Skool for deeper dives into more tools that sharpen your clarity, sharpen your precision, and sharpen your ability to influence. So if you take away only one thing from this video, just remember that leadership doesn't have to be mystical. It just needs to work.